Hello class, and welcome to week 4 of our ENC 1102 course. My name is Mr. Volz, and today we're going to be talking about the theories of psychoanalysis and Marxism. So I'd just like to give a little warning right off the bat. I am recording this week's lecture with a dog, a cat, and a hyperactive puppy somewhere in my vicinity. So I do apologize if there are any loud noises or potential disturbances or disruptions. My cat may be jumping up here to kind of join us, so just a little heads up before we get into this week's lecture. So, as we do every week, we do have our objectives that we're working toward, and you may notice that there are a lot more objectives for this week's lecture, for this week's content, than there have been for the past 3 weeks, and that's because of an upcoming assignment that I'm talking about very, very soon. But that assignment is going to ask us to kind of synthesize all of these learning objectives together. So this is really what we're going to be trying to get out of this week's lecture, or excuse me, this week's course content. Now, you may also see our readings here. We have 2 more readings on psychoanalysis and Marxism. Once again, we're continuing The Secret Garden. And we are also reading a poem by the renowned Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. So it's a very exciting week this week, I think. Now, for some upcoming assignments, you'll notice here that we have a little bit fewer assignments this week than we have been doing the past couple of weeks. We just have a quiz and the midterm paper. And the midterm is the reason why we don't have a discussion or a poetry response this week. Because I really want you all to focus on just writing the best midterm that you can. And I won't necessarily repeat myself from last week's lecture, or maybe repeat what we can already see on the midterm paper prompt, instructions, the guidelines for that. But I will just let you know that I promise it's not going to be as scary as you might think. In our poetry response from week 2, we practiced doing a close reading. What we've actually been doing all semester, our discussion posts, even the week 3 poetry response, it's all been close reading, analysis, your interpretation of the text. So I promise you, it's not going to be as scary or challenging as you think. And the midterm paper, we will be posting that in a discussion forum on our web course. So if you haven't already, by the time you're seeing this video, please go ahead and upload that as soon as you can. I myself will not be reviewing your midterms, rough drafts, but you will be receiving feedback from at least 2 of your peers in our class. You will receive feedback from me on your submitted version, your final version of the midterm paper. But as we announced, as we kind of discussed a little bit earlier last week, we actually do have what's called a shadow grading policy for our midterms. So if you do not do as well as you were hoping you would, if you're maybe not meeting your own expectations or standards for the midterm assignment when you receive my comments on it, you may feel free to submit a revised version of that draft that addresses my comments that will then become the score for your paper instead. So I promise there are plenty of opportunities to meet your desired performance for this assignment. And if you have any questions or concerns about that, please, please, please let me know in an email, come to our student hours. I promise I don't bite. I'm more than happy to help you, and please don't ever feel foolish if you have a question. We're working very challenging concepts, and I don't want you to feel like you're stranded on an island when you're not. You have me here. I'm more than happy to help you. Now, let's start getting to some of the real content of this week's lectures. Just a quick little biography like we usually do for our poets. So this week's poet is Rabindranath Tagore. You can see he's rocking that glorious beard there. He's a late 19th and early 20th century Indian poet, and he's actually the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. So that's very exciting. The Nobel Prize, I believe, is a Swedish prize, and so as you might expect, sometimes they lean a lot toward the maybe more European authors, and they also disproportionately award the Nobel Prize for Literature to Swedish authors. So that's a little something to keep in mind there. So Tagore wrote poetry, short stories, novels. He was very prolific in all of them, and he was a sort of modernist, but what we might call an Indian modernist. So if you maybe think back to week 1, we did talk about the modernist period in literature, which ran from it was in the 20th century. It was about everything pre-45, meaning before the year 1945. It's about the modernist period. Now we are now in the postmodern period, so post-45. Tagore put a slightly different spin on that. It's not really important for us to know that for our course. I just thought it'd be a little mellow mushroom tidbit that we could put here on our slide. Now, the poem we're reading this week is called Where the Mind is Without Fear. It's one of Tagore's more famous poems, and one of his most enduring as well. It's anthologized a lot, widely anthologized, so you're more than likely to come across it at some point if you're looking into the Indian literary tradition. And the poem is really just sort of discussing, it's alluding to Tagore's vision of a new India, the Indian independence movement. Those are the exact year dates for that. And a lot of critics kind of liken the poem to an inspiring hymn, inspiring Indians to pursue freedom, to pursue this vision. And I should say, actually, that what might help with this, if I backtrack a little bit, Indian independence movement, specifically a movement of independence from Great Britain, so England. And if you think about the Secret Garden, you may remember that Mary initially lived in India with her mother and her father. And we only ever really saw the Eurocentric perspective of India. We only really ever we don't hear from perhaps the Indian perspective of what it's like to be what we're going to learn in week 6, what it's like to be the colonized compared to the traditional white European colonizers. So we're seeing in this poem the other perspective from the one that we have been provided in the Secret Garden. And that's why we're reading that this semester, so we can see both sides of what we might call this equation. Now, let's get into the real meat of this week's lecture, starting with psychoanalysis. Now, I'm sure you all have heard of Sigmund Freud, not Sigmund and Roy. Sigmund Freud was that's a little bit colloquial. So it might be less important to know, for our class at least, the purposes of our class, about Sigmund Freud himself as it is that we know a little bit about what he did. So I'm not going to be spending too much time on this slide, because the more important thing that I really want to get to for our course at least, is what's on the next slide, the concepts that we might see applied more in literary works. So just maybe to keep some of this in mind. Okay, we have a bit of a new take here. So really, we're just going to be talking about 2 concepts, conscious and the Oedipus complex. That's all we kind of really need to know. We're not really going to go into too much detail with these concepts. We don't really need to know that. In fact, the most important things to know on this slide are what you already see here. And really, with the id, the ego, the superego, it's probably just important for our quiz, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that you just know their names. Now, we're starting from the top. The id just refers to our instincts, our impulses. And the id and the superego, they're both housed in the unconscious part of our personalities. The ego is housed in the conscious part of our personalities. Now, the id refers to impulses, like these bodily desires, and that includes the libido, so the sexual impulses as well. And as we're going to see down there with the Oedipus complex, the sexual impulses are very important to Freud in the stages of human development. But one thing we do need to know about the id is that Reality does not affect it. Everyday life is not affected. It's infantile. It just exists. From the time we're born to the time we become worm child. Now, the ego is our mediator. It's our decision maker. And what we need to know about the ego is that it houses the defense mechanisms that keep experiences unconscious. So, I'm reading right off the slide there. And an example for that might be painful memory, suppression. Your mind might suppress it so that you don't have to experience that experience. So that would be an example of a defense mechanism, suppression. And there are more, but we don't really need to know those for the purposes of our class, because again, class on literary theory, this is the small foundation. Excuse me. Now, the superego refers to the moral conscience. So, moral judgment, in other words. And really what we probably need to know about this one is, you might see me looking up my notes here. It's kind of like should we not, he loves me, he loves you not. It deals a lot with these sort of don't statements. So the superego, it reflects society's moral values. It's what determines it's like the voice of our conscience. Are we doing what's right? And it's also the source of our self-criticism. So it's like this on a sort of higher plane here. But that's really all we need to know. Again, the most important thing to know about the superego is that it just deals with the moral judgment. It's our moral conscience. Now, the Oedipus complex is a little bit tricky. Now, we might be tempted to think in terms of maybe a little bit more popular terms that this refers to incest, and the Oedipus complex is just synonymous with incest. And while it does kind of deal with sexual impulses, and it is referring to the developmental stage, it's like between a child between ages 3 and 5 and their parents, it's not synonymous with incest. So I don't want maybe us to think about it that way, even though just the very name is a bit uncomfortable. So if we're just looking at what we have here on the slides, the Oedipus complex, it begins with children. They do need their parents, but it begins when they realize that they're not the sole object of their parents' attention. And so this parent's probably going to be the mother. And we might take as a literal and a figurative example, breastfeeding. So figuratively, there will come a point, probably between the ages of 3 and 5 for a child, that the child realizes they're not the only one breastfeeding, we might say. So what happens? Well, for boys, they realize that they have these sort of like sexual feelings toward the mother, sexual possessiveness toward the mother, and they develop in turn, having realized that they share the mother with the father, they develop these murderous impulses toward the father. Boys do. And so they fear that the punishment for this aggression is castration. And we all know what that is. I'm not going to say it out loud. So you may notice then, from what we talked about and what's on the slides, that I didn't mention girls. So what about the girls? Why is it just the boys? That's when the concept of penis envy comes in. I beg you to stay with me here and try not to snicker too much. So, penis envy, it's like the castration anxiety for girls. See, the girls, according to Freud, realize that they do not have a penis, so they shift their sexual attachment, their sexual feelings from the mother, whom they breastfed, if we're going back to that example, to the father, who does have a penis. And I'm not going to go into too much more depth with this because it can get a little bit more complicated than that. I do want us to maybe think about that. And I also want to mention, because I thought it was kind of funny when I saw this, when I learned about it, was Freud considered his concepts related to penis envy to be his greatest work. And if we're maybe thinking about, if we're trying to think of saying this nicely, if we're thinking about what we talked about last week with, say, queer studies, then we might notice that with Freud here, he's really in that 19th century mindset of male-female. Now we know from queer studies that there are many possible gendered signifiers out there that we could be dealing with. So Freud didn't really account in at least a non-problematic fashion for women, and he definitely didn't account for queer identities, because now we know that even if biologically, no, I shouldn't say that, excuse me, we can have parents that are both men, parents that are both females, parents of varying gendered identities. So we can see there are obvious problems with Freud's concepts, but we might have to cut him a little bit of slack considering he was doing this 140 years ago. So that's all I think we probably really need to know about good old Freud here. So let's move on to maybe psychoanalysis in the literary world. And you're going to see me again referring to my notes. So psychoanalysis is in the literary world, so psychoanalytic literary theory is adopting Freud's psychoanalytic criticism, I should say, adopting the methods of what we might say reading that were employed by Freud and other theorists, but to interpret texts. So psychoanalytic theorists often argue that the unconscious desires of the author are expressed in the text that the author writes. So we could psychoanalyze a particular character within a literary work, but we could also assume, well, at least we could generally we assume that these characters were all projections of the author's psyche. So again, I think as we've mentioned before, texts are people talking. Texts don't just exist in a vacuum. They don't spring to existence. They come from people. And we all know what it's like to talk to people. Those biases, whatever it is, people are, whatever they project, that doesn't go away in their literary works. And that's where psychoanalysis comes in. So let's go ahead and psychoanalyze the author by psychoanalyzing the author's characters. One example of this might be the late Terry Goodkind, the fantasy author. And I think he wrote these books. It wasn't Sword of Shannara. I should have looked this up beforehand, but he did write these like sort of books, something like that. And two of the characters in there were pretty horrific caricatures of Bill and Hillary Clinton. I'm not making any political statement here, but it's pretty darn close. And so if we're psychoanalyzing that, we might be able to figure out what kind of makes Terry Goodkind tick, if you catch my drift. Now, to see some of our questions here that psychoanalytic theorists consider, not all of them, just some of them. What does a work suggest about the psychology of the author? What does a given interpretation of works say about the reader? Because, again, we're not talking about this semester, but we have concepts like reader response theory. And actually, I think in week 2, we talked about Roland Barthes and death of the author. And Barthes was arguing against the author being the end-all, be-all voice and interpretation of the text. Because of that, we opened up the floor to readers in literary criticism. And so, depending on a reader's interpretation of a work is going to suggest something about the reader, just as an author's production of a work is going to say something about the author. And let me check my notes, see if anything else we want to really be talking about. What we might also need to note about psychoanalytic criticism in the literary world is that we're dealing again with the unconscious. Psychoanalytic theorists emphasize that authors do not intend, or at least a psychoanalytic theorist in the performing the studies, they want you to make sure, or we want to make sure that we know that the author's not intending to do something. It's part of the unconscious. It's being the author's unconsciously revealing something about themselves through the creation of their characters, through the creation of this literary work. So the unconscious is very important to note about psychoanalysis. Now, so I can avoid maybe tripping over my words and we just kind of keep this in mind, let's go on to Marxism. Now, we don't have maybe too much we're going to be focusing on here. Just the biggest thing we need to know about Marxist literary theory is that it might help to maybe start with clearing up some assumptions. Now, if you watch the news at all, if you've read the news, any of that, talk to anybody in the past probably 4 years or so, even probably a lot longer before that, Marxism becomes a buzzword for communism. That is not, I repeat, that is not what Marxism refers to in literary theory. It is not referring to communism. Now, Marxism itself, minus the literary theory, that might be a little bit of a different story, but Marxist literary theory is not communist literary theory. I cannot stress that enough. It's not communist. Marxist literary theorists view socioeconomic conditions as being the most important factor to understanding the human condition as this condition is portrayed in a work of literature. So we're looking at socioeconomic conditions. So that's often questions of class, upper class, lower class, middle class. So Marxist literary theorists are examining who benefits and who suffers from the class system. So let's see here. The Marxist critic is also a very careful reader in terms of issues of power and money. Again, that's socioeconomic. What might help to maybe think of this in terms of like an example here, you'll notice at the bottom of the slide we have Jane Austen. Okay, so you might be wondering, why is Jane Austen there? Well, I'm recalling here, and I wish I could remember what book it was, but it might have been all of them because it's Jane Austen. I can recall a specific sentence, and I saw this example elsewhere as well. I think in maybe a literary theory book by Robert Dale Parker, an anthology, where Austen described, she focuses a lot on more middle and especially upper class characters and marriages and the problems that they experience. But one thing that she kind of maybe has a predisposition toward is almost being dismissive toward people of lower class. So that's a long-winded way of saying, if a cab driver opens up a door for an Austen character, that cab driver is not going to have a name. And the only time they're going to be mentioned is that when they're doing something for one of the upper class characters. So opening up that door, or maybe as a cook, as a chef, just serving a meal. That's all they're ever good for, is to just function like their economic function. The little job function is to open doors, to drive, to cook, to clean. That's all they're ever going to be boiled down to. That says a little bit of something, for going back to psychoanalysis, about Austen, is how is she perceiving members of the working class, people who are working class, compared to people who are upper class? Why are the upper class characters the only ones who get, why are the upper class characters primarily the ones who get this kind of character privilege, that they have, that their experiences become something, they have an experience that's in the book that goes beyond just what they perform for others? That's kind of that's a very tripping over my words way of understanding Marxism. So whereas a Jane Austen bellhop might just be carrying your luggage to the elevator and that's about it, an author who takes a deep dive into working class characters might focus on the bellhop's life. So that's why Marxist literary theory can be so important. We might also see this in Charles Dickens' literature a lot. And my personal feelings toward Charles Dickens aside, he does do a great job at depicting, perhaps a bit excessively and exaggeratedly, the horrific conditions for the working class. So maybe, say, in a book that really privileges the status of upper class peoples, Oliver Twist is nothing besides an orphan that someone passes on the street. But in a book that examines what it's like to live as that orphan, all of a sudden Oliver Twist goes from the orphan on the street to someone with a 500-page life story. So we're really looking at the role that class plays in a literary work. That's what Marxist literary theory wants us to look at. And Marxist literary theory also wants us to examine an author's interpretation and portrayal of class relations. Again, if we're thinking about Jane Austen there, I hope that example made sense. And so we might also consider, like, say, elitist attitudes toward the working class. How might we say that the upper class, no, excuse me, let me rephrase that. Marxist literary theorists are also looking about, say, what a given literary work says about economic, about social oppression. We might also consider how an author might be reinforcing the status quo, socially and economically, and how they might be breaking away from it. These are the kind of questions that Marxist literary theory wants us to look at. I do believe that's probably all that we really need to know about that. Probably spent a little bit more time talking about Marxist literary theory than I did about psychoanalytic literary theory. But I think Marxist literary theory, psychoanalysis has a lot of rabbit holes that we might have to go down. But Marxist literary theory, I think we can get the very basic premise of it off right out in front here with a little bit of explanation. So I know that was a little bit of not flying by the seam, but we were kind of a little bit all over the place there. But I do hope that this lecture can help clear up some of the concepts and the theories that we are discussing this week. So again, the most important things we need to know about psychoanalysis and Marxism for the purposes of our class. Psychoanalysis, we have the conscious personality, id, ego, superego, and we have the Oedipus complex. And psychoanalytic literary theorists are really trying to examine what a work says about an author. Because remember, texts are people talking. They're not just texts that spring from nothing. And Marxist literary theorists are examining how the portrayals, the grappling with socioeconomic conditions in a novel. We're looking at issues of class. We're looking at issues of oppression. We're looking to see how an author or an author's text may reinforce or break from the status quo in terms of class relations. So I hope that can help clear up some of these concepts. And again, if you have any questions or concerns, please come email me. I know that might have been a little bit more difficult to understand than maybe some of our previous lessons, but I promise I won't bite if you come and ask me. And please don't ever feel ashamed if you ask questions as well, I promise. The older you get, the higher up you go. Professors, they ask questions all the time. So please don't suffer in silence. If I can clear up anything for you, reach out to me through email, through a web course. Please come to our student hours on Wednesdays and Thursdays. Or if you want to write in a little YouTube comment, please feel free to do that too. I'll make sure to respond and clear up any questions that you might have about this. So, with that said, class, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next time.